You are unique, just like everybody else. Welcome to The Big Puzzle. In this podcast, we explore the subtle connections between science, religion, politics, economics, and history. One piece at a time, we unveil the big picture of this shared experience that we call life. Today, we're going to be talking about another important piece of the puzzle. You probably at this point realize that all the pieces of the puzzle seem to be important, but this one in particular has a very significant effect in our lives. This piece of the puzzle is diversity. Have you ever watched the TV show Bull? Bull is about a psychologist, Dr. Jason Bull, who developed a method to affect the results of trials. He does that by using high technology, manipulation techniques, reading body language, advanced analytics, and many other tools that he uses to understand how the jury is responding to the different arguments and the different stages of the trial. One of the problems that Dr. Bull has is that when a jury is selected, he doesn't have access to, what they're thinking or how they're evaluating the different arguments and the different evidence that is presented. But he has a lot of, techniques that allow him to monitor the vitals. For instance, the blood pressure, the heart rate, the body perspiration or the body temperature. Kind of if you think about a polygraph or lie detector. So he would really need to be able to measure all those things for each individual juror to make sure that, what he's telling his team to do, his attorney to do, has the desired effect. He also would like to be able to interview them and ask them questions about what they think about the different things that they've been presented to them. But as you probably know, jurors are isolated during the length of the trial. They're not supposed to talk to anybody. And obviously you should not be able to take vital or any kind of measurement from the jury. He still does some body language reading, but still it's limited in the sense that you can't place a camera pointing to each individual juror during the trial. To overcome this limitation, he developed a method that he called the mirror jury. So how does the mirror jury work? Well, in the mirror jury, he analyzes each individual juror and he finds somebody that matches them. So they take those parallel jurors and put them, into a room where they can witness the whole trial like they were part of the jury. And with them he can do whatever he wants. He can interview them, he can measure their vitals and do whatever he wants. So he uses them as proxy for the real jurors, and he makes decisions based on the reactions of those mirror jurors. For example, if one of the jurors, is a math teacher that has 2 children and, he likes jazz music, well, he would find somebody who's also a math teacher who has 2 children and he also likes jazz music. So he derives from the reactions of this person what the person who is actually sitting in the jury is thinking or is feeling, or how they're evaluating the evidence presented. This seems to be a really good idea, isn't it? I mean, why don't everybody do that? Well, there's a simple reason. It doesn't really work. Why mirror juries don't work in the real world? Well, there's mainly 2 reasons. Let's talk about the first one. Let's say that you can actually clone the actual juror. So you have a machine that, once the juror is selected, you put them in that machine, press a button, and you have, a copy, exact copy with the exact same experience, memories, and everything. And then you grab that person, that copy of the juror, and expose them to, your mirror jury. Well, The real problem is that being part of an experiment is very different than being part of the real thing. Part of you would affect you if you're in a real jury is, well, not being able to talk to anybody, right? So you will be processing things and you will be changing your mind based on what the evidence that is presented and so on. It will be really different if you had the opportunity to talk to somebody, that is constantly interviewing you and asking you questions about how you feel about this, what you think about that, right? That experience is so different that basically they will start diverging very, very fast. Also, it's very different when you're sitting in a room, knowing that it's the real thing, that your decision might significantly affect the lives of the people involved in the trial. When you're in an experiment, you're getting paid for and you have really no skin in the game. You could say pretty much whatever you want, they will pay you nonetheless. So again, the stakes are very, very different, and that will definitely affect how you evaluate things. Another thing is has to do with being connected to sensors. So when you're in a trial, you're probably, I've never been in a jury, but I guess that you have some uncomfortable chairs. You have some neighbors that might be distracting. And it's very different than sitting in a place where you're connected to, all these sensors that are measuring your vitals and whatever. So again, that experience is completely different. Even the point of view, when you are in situ, in that place during the trial, you're looking around. You're seeing the reactions of the defendant, or you're looking at the judge. So you're constantly shifting your attention based on what you say. You might get distracted by some things or not. That wouldn't be the same experience that you're sitting in a room looking at a screen that it has a fixed scene that you have to watch. So at this point, you understand what I'm trying to say. It's the way you would react in a trial has more to do with the experience than with your background. Right? So people with exact same background would react differently because of these conditions that we're talking about. And this could open the door for another piece that remind me we can talk some other time. That is the principle that you affect what you measure. Right? And that has some interesting implications. From physics to everyday life, it's something interesting to discuss in another episode. So if I forget, please remind me. Before we start talking about the second reason why a mirror jury wouldn't work, I need to introduce some concepts, and I hope that I make it simple enough for everybody to understand. So let's talk a little about dimensions. What are dimensions? Usually when we talk about dimensions, we think about a location, right? We know that we're in a three-dimensional world. That means that things had, length, height, and depth. We can measure those three dimensions. You can move in three different directions. Sometimes you could use the idea of time being a fourth dimension. In physics, it's something that is done quite usual. The physicists have taken the concept of dimension much further. To explain certain unusual phenomena, they needed to add more dimensions. And they came up with ideas about, some dimensions are wrapped around the other dimensions. And I don't know, I lost count, but I think that they were at 11 dimensions so far. But for most practical purposes, we can think our world being ruled by 3 or 4 dimensions. If we think about it, we could use this same concept of dimension for other things. So when we talk about characteristics, attributes, variables, those same concepts could be equivalent to a dimension. And that's something that is done in data science. So you call different things dimensions, even though they're attributes or characteristics. And we basically can describe these dimensions in 2 types. Some are numerical dimensions, things that could be measured by numbers, and the other are categorical dimensions. That something is of one class or another. For the numerical, we also have some distinction. We have the continuous, so it could take any number, that dimension, or could be discrete, that can only take certain numbers. And I'll put an example that I hope illustrates this. Let's say that we want to discuss the dimensions of a car, right? So we have the make of the car. The make of the car and the model of the car are actually categoricals. You don't have infinite values. You have a certain number of categories that you could put that car, right? So you have a Ford Focus, right? So those are, it could be a Ford, it could be a Chevrolet, it could be a Honda, whatever, right? But you only have these different classes. So that is a dimension, but it's a categorical dimension. The color of the car also usually is considered a categorical, because you have certain colors that have even certain names. Now, for instance, if you talk about the mileage of the car, that is a numerical dimension, and it's a continuum because it could have any number of miles, right? You don't have to have a specific numbers. Same thing could be for mileage per gallon or kilometers per liter. So those values are also numerical and continuous. Now, if you talk about the year when the car was manufactured, well, that's a numerical because the year is a numerical, but it's a discrete one. So usually you just talk about the year. You don't say the year, the month, the day, the hour, right? And another that could be, a numerical discrete, like the year, would be the number of owners that car had, right? It had 1, 2, 3, 4 owners. So this illustrates the idea of how many dimensions define a car. Now that we understand what dimensions are, let me tell you about a personal story. When I was doing my PhD, I had to decide on a project that would be, my dissertation. I wanted to tackle a problem in hydrology that has to do with hydrologic models for forecasting. Hydrologic models are fascinating. They are a way to represent inside the computer how the world actually behaves. That for me is fascinating. It really feels like you're playing God, right? You have your own little world and you can, run different scenarios and see what happens. And we will talk about that later, hopefully in another piece of the puzzle. But for now, I just wanted to tell you about some of the issues I encountered while trying to do that research. So what is the problem with these models? Well, the problem is that they take too long to run. Even with very fast computers, the number of processes that this model had to deal with, it's complicated. It takes way too long. The problem is that you can't really use them in real time. So let's say that you have a storm coming, right? And once you understand and you can see clearly what the storm will look like, if you put all those variables, all those dimensions into your model, and then you run it and wait for several hours for it to give you the results, and then you have to analyze the results and decide if you're going to issue a warning or not. It takes way too long. Probably people are already flooded by the time that you have the results. So what could you do? And what I decided to do is say, well, yeah, it's true. I don't have the time to run it on real time, but I have plenty of time to run models when the sun is shining. So why don't I just build hundreds, thousands of scenarios, of combinations of dimensions, and then run each of them individually? I store the result, I analyze them before, and now when the storm actually comes, I grab the model that looks the most to the conditions that we're facing. The assumption is that, if I have a scenario that is similar enough to my current conditions, I will have the results immediately. I don't have to run them more. I already did in the past. So I call that pre-computing models in uniform soil conditions. I don't know, it was a mouthful. But it granted me a PhD, so I'm very grateful that I did it. But when I was doing that, I realized something very important. I realized that I was cursed. The curse was the curse of dimensionality. That's why we needed to talk about dimensions. So let me explain it this way. How do I define what is a potential scenario so I can run the model while the sun is shining? Well, let's say that one of the most important things that I want to tell the model is how much it will rain. And if you think about it, that is pretty much a continuous numerical variable, right? It could be any value, any number of inches or millimeters. But I can't run infinite models. So I, split it, I make it discrete, and I say, okay, I will just pick 5 volumes of precipitation, right? So low, little higher, middle, little higher, and then high. So I could run those 5 scenarios, and then I will have 5 results to analyze. Unfortunately, that is not the only significant dimension for that model. I mentioned the total volume, but it's very different if that volume fell in a few minutes or if it took the whole day. So still could be 2 inches of rain, but did they happen all at once or did it happen throughout several hours? Obviously the result of the model will be different. So let's say now that I add another dimension, a dimension would be intensity. So now I have my 5 initial scenarios, and let's say that I pick 3 intensities. So all that volume of rain fell in, 10 minutes, an hour, 3 hours, or whatever, right? 3 different levels. Now I end up having 15 scenarios to compute, right? Because I have the initial 5, but for each of those 5, I have to consider the other 3, right? The intensity ones. But that is not the end of the problem, because there's another very important dimension that I have to consider. A watershed behaves completely different if it was initially dry when it started raining or if it was already wet. So if it had been a storm the previous day, and the soil is saturated, well, there will be a lot more runoff than if it's dry. If it hasn't rained in many, many days, then the water will just be absorbed by the soil and the runoff will be much slower. So I have to add that dimension, the dimension of humidity. And let's say that again, to simplify it, even though it's a numerical continuous variable, I will just pick 3 different levels of humidity for the soil. And now I have my 15 scenarios that I have to multiply by 3, because those apply to each of those 15 scenarios, right? So I could have high precipitation, middle intensity, high humidity, right? And all those combinations end up being 45. Well, 45 scenarios doesn't look that bad. But wait, there is more. There's something that is also very important. There's something that is called the canopy effect. The canopy effect measures how much of the water is actually intercepted by the trees, by the leaves in the trees. And sometimes they just get caught, they get eventually evaporated, or they come slowly into the ground, making it less intense and so on. So I have to consider seasons. When is the storm happening? And at least I need 2 seasons, right? Full canopy and no canopy. So now instead of 45, for each of the 45, I had to consider those 2 options. Is it the let's say this winter or the summer? And that now turns into 90. There's something important as well. It has to do with how much wind there is. If there is a lot of wind, that affects evaporation rates, also affects how the storm is moving. So I also have to consider the wind direction. So let's say that I consider 3 different wind intensities. Now we're at 270 different scenarios. And for wind direction, if I consider 8, now we're at, 2,160 different scenarios. I wish that was the end of it, but I also have to consider the temperature. So if it's cold, the water, the rain or the snow might fall and would just accumulate. They will freeze, and then we have a completely different process in which the runoff will be. But if it's very hot, might be that the water evaporates really fast, and that would diminish the total runoff. And so, as you can see, I need to consider different levels of temperature. Now, let's say that I consider 4 levels of temperature. Now my 2160 end up being 8640 different scenarios. Think that we have to spend several hours running each of those. For my PhD, I actually teamed with one of my of the other students that he was doing parallel computing, and I say, hey, can you run these several thousand models for me, and you can use it in your dissertation to show how your systems would work to run many models at once. So I end up having him doing that part. And I think for my research in a little basin close to here, the number of scenarios was, I can't remember, I think it was 70,000 or something like that, right? That I ran and saved the results. Now to finish the story, I put this into production in a little watershed south of where I live. And then for the rest of the time, I was just waiting for some flood to happen to validate my model. So while everybody was really hoping that no floods will happen, I was constantly wishing that one would. It didn't. I graduated nonetheless. But a few years later, I still had everything set up. And yeah, it gave me a warning for the first time that one of the scenarios, one of the potentially difficult scenarios had happened. So I went there, took some pictures, and nobody lived there, so it was not a big issue. But well, that was the end of the story. I think that methodology worked. That is the curse of dimensionality. What that means is that if you add many dimensions to a problem or to describe something, everything ends up being unique, right? You have the exponential growth on the possibilities of being something. So let's now use these concepts and go back to our mirror juror. We have our juror who, like we say, is a math teacher that is a father of 2 children, and he likes jazz music. Are those really significant? What about where did they grow up? What about their religion beliefs? What about the number of siblings and what was his relationship with his or her siblings? What about their age? What about their previous jobs? How long have they been a math teacher? Is it something that they wanted to be or something that they had to be because they couldn't get another job? What about their ancestry and their family traditions? So if we consider all these other dimensions, you realize that those 3 initial ones don't make any sense. You're not going to get the same response just because of 3 arbitrary dimensions. And again, we are all affected by this curse of dimensionality. That curse is what makes you unique. You are absolutely unique. If you don't believe me, start thinking about who is exactly like you. Even trying to find somebody who is similar to you is difficult. What about diversity then? Well, diversity is unavoidable. There is no way that you can avoid diversity. If you look into enough dimensions, and we usually don't, you would realize that everybody is absolutely unique. In one of the other videos I talk about people from Norway, how uniform they were until very recently. But that only applies to individual, obvious, visual, I could say, dimensions, like the skin color, the genetics, external features mostly, some very obvious cultural traditions or things like that. But if you go deeper and deeper, there's no 2 Norwegians that are the same. So when we start judging situations saying that they don't have enough diversity, the real problem is that we're not considering enough dimensions. And most likely we're not considering the dimensions that are really important. One of the ironies about the proponent for more diversity is that the first thing that they do is they reduce the diversity. So now suddenly, instead of being this rich, complex human being full of experiences and things like that, you become a skin color. You become a sexual preference. You have to put this uniform, and uniform is exact opposite of diversity, right? You are this, and you have to behave this way, and you need this, and you're entitled to this just because of you are this. That is completely unfair. That reduces the beautiful of diversity that we have. Instead, we should just let diversity be and focus on other things. So I know that people have good intentions in general when they're trying to propose more diversity, but I think they don't understand what they're really asking for. As many things, and this is another piece of the puzzle that I hope that we will discuss sometime, there are certain processes, certain philosophies that sometimes transform into certain political views that always get the exact opposite of what they aim to do. And this is one case. If you're trying to promote diversity,
stop it. Get some help.
So if I could give you some homework, I would invite you to look around you. Find somebody and start exploring their dimensions. In which ways they are normal, in which ways they are close to the average, just like everybody else. In which ways there are outliers, why they're different. How can you benefit from that? Maybe they have some, weird experiences that you will never have. And by talking to them, you can learn some very interesting things. Maybe you will find that you can teach them some things as well. So if you do that, you will start understanding that diversity doesn't really need any help. In future videos, we will be talking about the two other sisters to diversity, that they always come together, and those are equity and inclusion. And hopefully you will understand why in my previous video I call it an elaborated scam. That doesn't mean that the proponents are scammers. I think that many people are really well-intentioned and actually are victims of some other people who are actually trying to benefit from actually destroying diversity for creating divisions in the world. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it with somebody, subscribe if you like this type of content, and leave a comment. I'm always interested to think what people think about what I'm talking. So, hope to see you next time. Until then,